Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today on assessing initiatives serving men of color in community colleges. My name is Luke Wood, and I'm a faculty member at San Diego State University and co-director of the Minority Male Community College Collaborative, along with my colleague Frank Harris III, who is also co-director of M2C3 and a faculty member here at San Diego State. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. This quote is attributed to W. Edward Deming. Many of you have heard us say this quote before, but it really applies to today's conversation on better understanding systems, how students are experiencing those systems, our colleges and universities, and using that information to design interventions that can help and aid them in being more successful. So our focus today really, there are many different types of assessment, but really is on needs assessment and using needs assessment to design and refine programs and initiatives serving men of color in our community colleges. So the purpose of the webinar today is threefold. First, we want to discuss current trends and critical issues that affect experiences and outcomes for men of color in community colleges. Second, we're going to propose a process for using institutional needs assessment to inform practice in serving men of color in community colleges. And then we're going to present some inquiry tools that we believe can aid evidence-based practice for institutional and program level assessment in our community colleges. As normal, if you are engaged in social media, we will be answering, responding to questions and comments at the hashtag M2C3, that's hashtag M2C3, and you can see the Twitter handles for M2C3, myself, and Frank Harris. So, what is M2C3? Well, many of you know that we started M2C3 in 2011 to provide support to community colleges that were engaged in initiatives and efforts designed to improve the success of historically underrepresented and underserved men in our community colleges. And our focus really is on men of color. And we have focused primarily on Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, Native American, and Pacific Islander men, but we recognize that many of the strategies that we talk about are applicable to other underrepresented male groups as well. In terms of our activities, we have a number of different activities that we're engaged in. This webinar is part of the series of webinars and information sharing sessions that are hosted as part of the National Consortium on College Men of Color. The National Consortium is a place where community colleges can come together to gain information and learn about efforts and strategies for enhancing the success of men of color. Many of the colleges that are participating in today's webinar are part of the consortium. At our next webinar, we'll actually highlight those colleges as part of the webinar. We also want to thank our affiliate partners who support the consortium along with us. Those affiliate partners include the Community College League of California, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and the African American Male Education Network and Development AMEND organization. These organizations help to provide us with guidance on the efforts that we're engaged in to support the work of the consortium. We also, of course, as you know, have many research and products that we produced. One, we did a couple webinars, one on counseling men of color, one on teaching men of color. As you can see this picture there, the guidebook that was produced as part of that process. The webinar for the teaching men of color and all our previous webinars are available on our website free of charge, so please go there and check those out. You can also gain a link to the guidebook on our website as well, where you can learn more about that product. And then, of course, we have assessment and evaluation tools that are supported as part of M2C3, several of which we will actually have the chance and opportunity to talk about today. In terms of the work that we do, we would be unable to do it without an incredibly diverse and talented group of emerging scholars who are supporting us in these efforts. So you can see pictures of myself and Dr. Harris there, but also other members of the team who are helping us to advance inquiry, advance understanding of challenges, and promote research that's focused on men of color in community colleges. In terms of why we focus on community colleges, we know that there are 947 public two-year institutions in the United States. The overwhelming majority of our Black and Latino and other men of color are concentrated in these community colleges. You've probably heard us say before that much of the research that's focused on men of color in post-secondary education is focused on four-year colleges and universities. However, given where these men are in terms of their distribution, we think it's important to refocus those efforts to better understand the experiences and challenges of men of color in community colleges. And that's important because we know that men of color in community colleges are very different from their colleagues in four-year institutions. For example, here's some key data points. We know that 43% of Latino men and 54% of Black men have delayed their enrollment into college. As a result, these men are more likely to be older than their peers, they're more likely to be independent, they're more likely to have dependents. For those who delay their enrollment, we know that they're waiting on average 4 to 5 years before coming into the community college. We know that many of these men are first-generation students. High percentages of them are low income. Because of the delay that many of these men have in terms of entering the community college, we know that then as a result, they've been away from academic pursuits for some time. As a result, it's not surprising that we can see that 43% of Latino men and 44% of Black men in community colleges are in remedial or developmental or basic skills education. And for those who are in those courses, they are oftentimes engaged in multiple types of developmental support. We also know that many of these men attend college less than full-time because of their commitments to their families and caring for dependents, and also working in other external commitments that they may have. In terms of why we do the work that we do, we know that outcomes for men of color in community colleges are not on par with those of other ethnic groups. Here, just on this slide, highlight some interesting data. These data may be different from some of the national data that you see because most of the national data focuses on first-time, full-time certificate and degree-seeking students. So this data here is inclusive of both full-time students and part-time students. So we use a longer range for persistence and a longer range for measuring other outcomes on a 3-year time frame or a 6-year time frame. But just one key point, we can see that in terms of transfer, that only 20% of Black men and 19% of Latino men will transfer to a 4-year college or university in a 6-year time frame in comparison to 35% of all other men. We know that in terms of those who set out to earn a certificate or degree, that very few of those men are doing that within a 6-year time frame, really 1 in 10. So obviously these data really are a call to action for us to engage in efforts and strategies to enhance the success of men of color in our community colleges.
Our work is informed by a set of theories and concepts we'd like to take a few minutes to discuss and share with you. Some of us may be aware that colleges have a tendency to see a problem, typically a problem that's revealed in data or equity gaps, and try to fix it immediately with money or personnel, but essentially without doing needs assessment to determine what the root causes are, which can really lend themselves to addressing the issue in a way that's not effective. And this approach is represented in the first set of boxes on this slide that are labeled the data paradigm. And instead, the approach that we advocate, it comes from Dr. Estella Ben-Simone's work, is the inquiry paradigm, where institutions examine data, they identify gaps, they take the time to inquire into the root causes or what are some of the contextual factors that enable those gaps to exist and persist, which lead to informed solutions that have to be evaluated in light of the root causes. Second, many of us are probably aware that student engagement is a common concept that's often used among educators in conversations on student success in college. And engagement essentially involves the time, and effort students invest in their studies or other educationally purposeful activities. For example, collaborating with peers, using technology, being academically challenged, interacting with faculty, and so forth. And there's been ample evidence that suggests that greater levels of engagement, particularly academic engagement, leads to enhanced student outcomes for students. And engagement is critically important. However, really is a more fundamental question posed. And that is, have we as educators made our students feel welcomed to engage? And as such, willingness to engage has become a critical component of our work here at M2C3. Because we know, for example, that men of color, a critical mass of men of color who enroll in community colleges have had less than ideal K-12 experiences and may not necessarily have the dispositions or necessarily the readiness to engage in a way that leads to student success. So we think it's critical that educators create conditions that welcome their engagement. And we measure welcomeness to engage in a number of different ways in our work. We look at it both as a factor within college classrooms as well as outside of college classrooms. And some of the questions that we ask students are, to what extent do you feel welcome to ask questions in class, for example? Or how likely are you to approach a faculty member informally outside of class? And these are some examples of how we get at welcomeness to engage in our work. And the key point here that we like to stress is that while understanding engagement and action control in some of these intermediate outcomes are important, we think there needs to be much more focus and attention placed on looking at the factors, the effective responses, as well as the positive facilitators, and factors that actually lead students to feel a welcomeness to engage. And next we have our social ecological outcomes model. If any of you have been on any of our webinars previously, you've seen us present this before. And you know that it essentially guides all of the work that we do here at M2C3. Now, we don't have the opportunity in this webinar to walk through the model in detail, but we would like to direct your attention to the SEO domains, the socio-ecological domains that are positioned in the middle of the model. And each domain contains a specific set of variables that impact student success for men of color in community colleges. And the domains emphasize interactions between societal, environmental, interpersonal, and campus-based factors that influence student success outcomes for these men. So essentially what this model represents and suggests is that men of color enter community college contexts with a set of background-defining factors, as well as having experienced salient societal factors that shape their dispositions when they enroll in community colleges. And there are several socio-ecological domains that are taking place within their college experience: non-cognitive factors, academic factors, environmental factors, as well as campus ethos. And it's the interactions between these domains and all of these factors and the variables that are contained within them that ultimately shape student success outcomes for men of color.
So one of the important things to remember in having us present some of these theoretical models that help to guide our work is that, now there has been more research done on men of color. There are some things that we know that we can be looking for in terms of campus ethos, in terms of students' academic experiences, in terms of non-cognitive outcomes. So we present these theories to help provide a guiding framework for the work that you all will engage in as you employ inquiry to better understand the challenges and experiences of men of color on your campuses. So that's why we present that information. I'm going to talk a little bit about a comprehensive framework for institutional assessment, but before doing so, it's really important to highlight why we engage in assessment. So we engage in assessment because it helps to do a number of positive things, and you can see them here on your screen. Assessment illuminates systemic trends and patterns that are experienced by students on campus. It helps to foster critical conversations on student equity. nothing is more powerful than taking data from surveys and focus groups and interviews with students and presenting that data to faculty and staff and having them engage in conversations and helping them to make meaning of how students are reporting their experiences on campus, and then using that information to guide interventions for these men. We know that it can also foster organizational learning. Really, our focus has been a lot on the importance of using the information to identify areas in need of enhanced attention. Many of our programs serving men of color and initiatives serving men of color don't have a endless supply of resources to be able to operate them. So identifying those needs are important, because what it helps to do is to focus the efforts that are in place and maximize those efforts on those most salient challenges that these men of color are experiencing. So really, it helps to refine what that focus should be. It helps us to test some of the common assumptions that we may have and to explore what is known and also what is unknown. And many colleges now have strategic plans that at least acknowledge the importance of focusing on historically underrepresented and underserved students. Engaging in inquiry, especially on the front end, helps us to reassess what those plans are so that they can be in better alignment with some of the needs that students are having. In terms of assessment and evaluation, we really see that it should be occurring at 3 primary stages. Today's conversation is really on needs assessment, focusing assessment on the front end, meaning that before you engage in programs, or if you are revising programs that are in place, that you explore what are those needs of the students, how are they experiencing the campus, but also that you do the same thing with faculty and staff, because really successful interventions for men of color don't just focus on men of color, but also the campus environment and educators who are interacting and working with them. Then, once you have that information, you implement a plan of action to really address some of those key factors that they're experiencing. And then you can look at those interventions and do a process assessment and evaluation, looking at where are the resources going, how are the services being used, who's using the services, and then what many of us conceptualize as outcomes, or the other types of assessment that we've engaged in really focuses on outcomes. For example, learning outcomes and effective growth and performance outcomes. Are those programs being successful? And we're going to actually do a separate webinar that really talks about how you can engage in some of those practices for outcomes assessment. But some of the tools that we're going to share today, while they're designed for needs assessment, also lend themselves based upon the way that they were designed for some of those approaches. In terms of the assessment cycle, we're going to talk about 8 key stages, really honing in on stages 4, 5, and 6 based upon the topic of today's presentation. So setting the stage in terms of an initiative for men of color, forming a working group, clarifying the purpose and goals of what's taking place, and then reviewing the data that's available, engaging in assessment, interpreting those findings. Again, the focus really of today's presentation. Disseminating the plan, implementing the plan, and of course, engaging in assessment and evaluation of that plan. So we believe that engaging in that inquiry paradigm where you employ inquiry to better understand what's going on with these men really involves, at first, setting the stage. And when we say setting the stage, we mean really creating an institutional sense of urgency and awareness of the challenges that are facing men of color on campus. So one of the things that we suggest is when starting an initiative is to have a convocation, a faculty senate meeting, a staff senate meeting, college colloquium, or even an email that comes from the executive leadership on campus, preferably the president or VP, that announces the initiation of an assessment process that will result in the development and implementation of a program for men of color. It's important that that message comes from executive leadership on campus because it creates added buy-in. And also from an assessment standpoint, it increases the likelihood that there'll be greater participation in the assessment process, meaning that you'll then have better data to be able to guide those interventions. So in terms of what that communication should look like from the president or executive leader, preferably during some sort of convocation or colloquium, illustrate that urgency, talk about the institutional data, discuss the timeliness of it in terms of the national efforts that are taking place, convey that it's a high priority. When it's a high priority to the campus administration, it's taken more seriously, and explain the benefits of not only the assessment process, but improving outcomes for men of color. And then, of course, and really engaging in this inquiry part, and invite that initial feedback from all campus personnel and students. Ask them for their opinions, identify a key point person where they can send an email to or come and talk to provide their initial perspectives and insights. That's data that will then be important for further steps in the process. The second thing that you want to do is to form a working group that will guide the assessment process. This working group may also be the same individuals who will guide an initiative or program for men of color, but it doesn't always have to be the same group. Either way, when you design a working group that's going to engage in looking at the data, you want that working group to be small in size, 7 individuals, 15 max. The working group membership should be made up of people who are influential on campus, but also have experience working with men of color, because their experiential knowledge is also key to informing not only the types of assessments that are employed, but how that data is interpreted. So if in terms of people who should be on the working group, you definitely want to have faculty members who are key leaders on campus, staff members, administrators. You want to have external partners, maybe people in industry or external researchers from local universities. You want to have those folks who can provide an outside perspective. But let me be clear, you do not have a working group unless you have students intimately involved in the process. We believe that involving students in the process, allowing student leaders to serve as members of the working group and help to interpret and look at and analyze and make meaning of the data is important, because it provides a perspective that comes from a different vantage point than other members of the team. You should also identify a trusted facilitator. The published research often recommends that this person be an external colleague, but it doesn't always have to be. As long as there is someone who is trusted. Their key roles will involve moderating, scheduling the meetings, establishing common definitions. For example, what do we mean by persistence? What do we mean by student success? How are we defining the success of our efforts? It's important to come to common definitions so that people can be in the same room talking about the same thing. Nothing can distract a conversation more when one person is using one word, another person is using a similar word, but they have 2 very different meanings of what that is. The trusted facilitator can also coordinate information, document the process, and engage in follow-up with other key members of the team.
So now that the stage is set, the work group has been formed, it's going to be important to spend some time with the work group to clarify the purpose and the goals of the assessment process, right? So it's going to be important that that work is connected to the college's strategic plan or any other important institutional documents that are in place. Work group members also need to be clear about what they hope to learn on behalf of the institution by engaging in the process, and what are some of the anticipated outcomes of the work going to be. It's very important that you have some clarity on these issues and questions as the work of the group moves forward. Discussing and understanding the benefits of the assessment are also important. A few previous slides ago, Luke kind of talked about why an institution might engage in this type of assessment on behalf of men of color. So kind of revisiting some of those questions and reasons would be important, and also understanding how it's going to strengthen the institution overall. Having a clear set of norms, guiding principles, and ground rules should be discussed as well. Having some norms around how group members will engage each other throughout the process. And also recognizing that some of the conversations around equity and student success with men of color can be very emotionally charged. So providing some space for work group members to work through some of those emotions, but to do so in a way that's productive and doesn't detract away from the work of the group will be critical. So step 4 is essentially about reviewing, if you're reviewing this data for the first time, or re-reviewing it if work group members have had the opportunity to see it before. But using student outcomes data to discuss trends and challenges is going to be a critical component of this work. So some questions that the work group may engage are how men of color at the college doing in relation to other populations, getting some clarity on what is known, what is not known, and what the group assumes to know about the experiences of men of color would also be important. So one point that we have here is discussing myths, realities, and assumptions. Oftentimes there are narratives and stories and other things that are said and believed about a college or about the experiences of students at a particular college. So it's going to be important to distinguish that which is anecdotal knowledge and that which is actually grounded in evidence. And agreeing upon assessment strategy and choosing assessment tools is a critical part of this process. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have several tools that we'd like to share that could be considered for work on men of color. But having some agreement around what tools and what strategies are going to be used to guide the assessment is an important component. Step 5 is actually conducting the self-assessment. So having a clear timeline and a process for how the data is going to be collected, analyzed, and reported is important. These are decisions that should be made as early as possible in the process, even if some of these decisions are tentative. But discussing them before the work and the momentum of the group moves forward is going to be important. And also being clear about what data will be collected and in what process, what order is going to be collected. So some colleges may decide to do some survey data collection, do some qualitative data collection with interviews and focus groups. So just having a sense of how the data collection is going to be sequenced. Again, and as well as thinking about how does that factor into our timeline for analysis and reporting is going to be something that you want to consider. And then also getting some sense of what the sample of students is going to be. If you're going to be doing any type of quantitative data collection or any type of surveys, making sure that you're able to recruit a sample that reflects the population of the college is going to be important. And of course, with any qualitative data collection, the sample need not necessarily be representative, but it should be purposeful. So one should consider which students are best positioned to provide the type of insights that the work group needs and seeks. How are we going to make sure that sample is going to be reflective of the larger student population? And this last point on the slide is absolutely critical with respect to equity work. Ensuring that all students have the opportunity to have their voices heard is something that should be considered. Continuing with the same step, step 5, engaging in the assessment, engaging in the actual self-assessment, monitoring the progress of data collection throughout the data collection period and adjusting the sampling strategy may also be needed. Oftentimes we do not immediately get the type of samples that we initially sought and have to do some additional steps to recruit more students as examples, or to target students in different ways would be something that you want to be mindful of. Once all the data are collected, analyzing the data for salient trends and patterns is going to be another important step. So looking at what trends and challenges appear to be consistent across the data, where there's some areas of divergence across the data. So sometimes it's one may think, wow, if there's some points of divergence or points that do not necessarily align with some of the previous knowledge that we've gathered or previous evidence, those could be very fruitful and insightful opportunities for further investigation. Understanding what are some new lessons learned or some new insights that have emerged from this process would be also important to document those. And what is it that we know now that we did not know prior to the assessment? And of course, we always, because this work always has to be contextualized, within the local context as well. Our next step, step 6, is actually engaging in some interpretation of the findings. So in ways that we do that is looking at the findings in light of data from other data sources. That could be some of the student outcomes data that were previously reviewed before you actually engage in the assessment process. Different programs on the campus may have program review data that could be helpful. Looking at some of the larger data sets such as iPads, or if your college is engaged in the SESI project, that could be another important data source that should be considered. If you have any Achieve the Dream data on your campus, that could be another good data source that could be examined in light of the data that you collected by way of this process. So recognizing that community colleges often have limited resources, well, all institutions tend to have limitations, or tend to have resource limitations. It's going to be important that you identify areas in need of the most immediate attention. So we like to call this triage, and think about what actions can be implemented in the short period of time, say within the next 6 to 12 months, to address the pressing issues and concerns that negatively impact the experiences of men of color, experiences and successes of men of color. So, we also want to think about how do these areas that are in need of immediate attention currently align with other institutional priorities. And again, this is where having good alignment between this process and the strategic plan, the current strategic plan of the institution, is really helpful. Also interpreting the findings, so we have to think about short-term strategies, but we also have to think about immediate and longer-term strategies, things that can be done over the next 18 months, and also need to ask what are some steps that we can take to ensure that our long-term strategies are scalable, sustainable, cost-effective, and institutionalized. So again, thinking about step 1, where you have the institutional leadership set the stage and talk about the importance of the assessment, this is where we want to connect this discussion around sustainability to some of the priorities that were articulated in that first step of this process. It's one thing to gather knowledge on behalf of the college, but disseminating that knowledge and doing some action planning is equally important. There's a number of different ways that colleges can disseminate the results of assessments to campus communities. Typically, colleges that do a good job of this engage in multiple strategies for assessment, so written reports, websites, certain town hall meetings, flex day presentations. But there's a lot of different things that can be done. The key is to figure out how do you make sure that the information permeates multiple boundaries at the campus, and that there's broader awareness of what was learned from the process. It would not be good if only the members of the work group understand what's going on and have some insight as to what was learned from the assessment process. And action planning is an important step here, right? So thinking about what are some programs that can be established, what are some institutional policies that need to be reconsidered in light of what we learned from this assessment, what are some practices that need to be reshaped, if we're going to enact targeted interventions, to whom should they be directed, and of course, how do we continue to use inquiry to guide the work and our actions that we're doing? So think about those boxes in the inquiry paradigm, and that last box, evaluation of informed solutions, loops right back to the inquiry into the causes. And finally, at step 8 is when we actually implement and assess the actions that have been taken. So establishing benchmarks and a period of performance monitoring, recognizing that how are we going to know we're making progress towards our goals, towards our benchmarks? How do we know that we're doing better? And then also re-engaging the self-assessment process on a regular basis is important. So, maybe thinking about that initial work group, continuing to convene and meet on a regular basis in order to monitor and provide leadership on this process for the college.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we use here at M2C3 to engage in inquiry that's relevant to needs assessment for men of color. Now, let me also say here that there's other folks who we may look to for instruments. So you also have campus-based institutional researchers who may have expertise in instrument development. They can also help you with this. So these are by no means the only instruments that are out there. We only offer these as opportunities to gain more information on what's out there, and also to help you strategize about different ways in which you can have better information to work with your students. So one of the first instruments that we usually talk about is the Community College Student Success Inventory. We did a webinar on this a few webinars ago on this instrument. It's a free instrument that's available through M2C3. All you do is you send us an email with the subject line CCSSI and give us emails that you would like to have for people you would like to have access to it. Now, what the instrument is an institutional self-assessment tool. So what you want to do with this instrument is you have 6 overarching areas of institutional action and support: financial aid, student services, teaching and learning, institutional resource, MMIs, and early alert systems. You would want to give this to experts on your campus who have extensive knowledge about what's taking place in this area. So less important to have many people fill it out and more important to have the right people fill it out. So you can think of anywhere between 15 to 30 people who might provide insight on what's taking place in each of these individual areas. This instrument was validated by subject matter experts, and it was developed. What we did was we looked at the research on men of color in community colleges and what the recommendations were for best and promising practices at the institutional level. And so it's a series of questions about those practices in each of these different areas. And then people basically self-assess themselves, and then you can come together as the working group and then filter through it and then talk about some strengths and opportunities and areas for improvement. Here is a quick screenshot of just one of the different areas that we have with the online version of the CCSSI. So for example, one thing to look at is, does the institution have an early alert system? Are faculty and staff trained on how to use that alert system? Do faculty and staff actually use the system regularly? So these are things where you can rate yourselves on a scale of not at all, minimally, proficiently, or it's not applicable, but also then provide comments. Again, fewer people would fill this out, but then it would be used to provide the working group with information on areas that may be in need of intervention. The next instrument you've heard us talk about a lot, and that is the Community College Survey of Men. Basically, this instrument is an institutional needs assessment tool that's designed to be taken by students. This is essentially classroom-based sampling of students who complete the instrument using a paper Scantron form. The information is then used for benchmarking, performance monitoring, and really the most important part, and especially in context of this webinar, is identifying areas in need of enhanced attention. This instrument, and really all the instruments that we have, are theoretically grounded in the SEO model. We've validated this instrument over a 3-year period using 9,000 respondents at over 55 community colleges, so it's not a fly-by-night instrument. It's one there's been a lot of time and attention and detail and hard work that's went into dialing in the scales that are associated with it. It looks at campus ethos in terms of faculty welcomeness, perceptions of belonging from faculty and staff. It looks at non-cognitive outcomes, such as student self-efficacy, whether they're, the perception of the worthwhileness of the college degree. It looks at masculinity, whether the men's willingness to seek out help, the perceptions of school as a domain that's suited for men and women. It looks at environmental pressures, so it's really comprehensive in what it looks at. And then what we do with this is we provide colleges with essentially reports, a larger report, but then 3 breakout reports, one for faculty, one for staff, and one for folks in student services that are working with retention-based programming with specific areas that they should focus on based upon the results, but broken down for each racial ethnic group. So you would get information on what should be focused on for white men, for Black men, for Mexicano men, for Latino men, for Southeast Asian men, on down the line. And here's just a quick screenshot of what the CCSM, the Community College Survey of Men, actually looks like. A new instrument that many of you have not heard about yet, we've only announced this a couple times during presentations, and that's an instrument that we've developed. It's fully free of charge that you can use, again, just like the CCSSI. You send us an email, you say, I have a program that serves men of color, I need your instrument, you tell us who needs access to it, and we will send it to you. And it's called the MPACE, the Male Program Assessment for College Excellence. It's a program-level outcomes assessment tool that's designed really for multiple distributions, so you can see how students are changing over time as a result of the interventions that are in place. And actually, some of the information from this instrument was recently highlighted in our blog on Huffington Post on teaching men of color and mentoring men of color. So what we did was we started out, and we did this with a team of our researchers. We looked at minority male programs around the country, and we looked at what are the common funding sources they have, what are the common missions they have, but probably more importantly for this, what are the primary services they have, and what are the primary outcomes that they're targeting. From that, we identified the primary interventions that are being employed, and the two most common were mentoring and leadership development, but there's many others that we identified. And then from there, what we did was we linked that, as you can see here on this chart. On the top are those interventions, and then on the left-hand side, you can see the actual outcomes that were identified by the programs in terms of what they were looking for. So academic self-advocacy, student sense of belonging, personal self-confidence, resilience, self-esteem, a positive racial regard, and then, of course, performance outcomes, persistence, achievement, attainment, transfer. And this instrument's designed to measure those things for programs that are serving these men. Again, it's designed primarily as an outcomes tool, but there's also some information here that would also lend itself for needs assessment, which is why we included it in this particular webinar. So if you're interested in this instrument, just send us an email. We'll send it over to you. We want to make sure that you have the tools that you need to be able to do the great work that you are doing. And since we're just going over this very briefly, please know that next week we're going to release a video that's fully focused just on the MPACE, the Male Program Assessment for College Excellence. The video will show you how to access the tool, how to use the tool, and how to some degree, interpret the findings in light of the work that you're doing. So look out for that video. If you are subscribed to our listserv, you will get it. It will also be posted on our website. Everyone who's subscribed to the listserv will get it. Lastly, before I turn it back over to Dr. Harris, I would like to note that we are also in the midst of developing other tools that are focused on staff, that are focused on other key groups on campus. The one that's probably the closest to being developed, and really now in the pilot stage, is a faculty tool that's designed for completion by faculty, that's based upon the information that we gleaned from the narratives that we did with faculty who have successful track records of working with men of color, that was highlighted in the guidebook. And then that will be an instrument that we will announce when that's fully available for those who are interested in it. So just know that we continue to work and create more instruments that we believe will assist you in the work that you're doing, and we thank you for that work.
Thank you, Luke. The last tool we'd like to share with you is the Community College Insights Protocol. And this is a process that we use, a tool that we use in conducting focus groups with men of color at community colleges. And this tool was actually adapted from a focus group process that was developed by Dr. Kenneth Gonzalez, who's a professor in the education program at CSU Fullerton. And what it enables us to do is to obtain qualitative insights directly from men of color about how they experience community colleges. It is a consensus protocol, so it enables participants to collectively identify challenges, as well as propose recommendations for needed action. And the protocol, as you'll see, it focuses primarily on identifying salient challenges, factors that enable students to overcome these challenges, as well as institutional practices that facilitate their success. So this is a screenshot of what the matrix typically looks like. As you can see, it has a set of questions that span the top of the matrix. So we begin by asking men of color, what are some salient challenges you face as a man of color at this college? And we give them a few moments to think about those challenges, typically tell them to identify 3 to 5 challenges. And then we begin by asking each student who's a part of the process to rank order the challenges that they've identified, and we ask them to share them. So just to give you a sense of what are some of the type of data that we obtain from this process. So a student, for example, may say racial stereotypes. I feel like there are people at the campus, other students, faculty, and staff who sort of look at me in light of racial stereotypes about men of color. We try to get a sense, some sort of quantitative sense about how many guys in the group who experience the same challenge. And then we ask the students, well, in light of this challenge, what are some personal factors that enable you to overcome them? What is the campus currently doing that helps you succeed despite this challenge? And then what are some advice you will offer to campus leaders about how they can better support men of color in overcoming this challenge? And to give you a sense of what the protocol looks like, so we actually use Post-it paper. We post it around the room, and we actually complete the matrix so the students can see the insights that they're providing actually being captured in real time. So that's the final tool that we have to share. Thank you again for attending this webinar. Before we conclude, we would like to let you know that our next webinar is going to focus on equity planning for facilitating student success for men of color. That's going to be happening on May 14th. And of course, if you're already on our listserv, we will share information well in advance so you can register for that webinar if you're interested in it. The audio recording for today's webinar will be available within 24 hours, so if you've missed any parts of it, or if you'd like to share it with a colleague, it will be available on our website via link that you can post. And Luke is going to conclude with a final point as we wrap up. Thank you.
So just a couple of housekeeping items. One, we have the working group meeting coming up for those who are members of the consortium. If you go to our website and click on the consortium link, you can get information there on how to register and information on the hotels and all that stuff for the working group meeting. Again, at the working group meeting, for those who are members of the consortium, we're going to be talking about sustainability planning, strategic planning, leadership development, fund development, so a number of different topics that are relevant to initiatives and programs serving men of color. If your college has yet to join the consortium, we hope that you will. Reach out to us. We can send you some information, and hopefully you can become part of this intellectual community that's been created. One of the things that was noted we saw in monitoring the Twitter feed, a gentleman named Michael said this is good advice, but he wants to hear what folks who have learned from this. Well, as part of the consortium, we host information sharing sessions. So where people who are engaged in this work come together who are practitioners in fields and can talk about their experiences. And so we continue to invite folks who are engaged in this work to share their insights, and we will let you know as those events approach, and that will be a good opportunity to be able to gain some of that information. And lastly, we just want to conclude again by thanking our affiliate partners with the consortium, the Community College League of California, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and the African American Male Education Network and Development for their support of this project and these efforts. If you have any questions, again, we'll be monitoring the Twitter feed for some time, so just reach out to us via social media, or send us an email or give us a phone call. As you can see, you have the information there. We look forward to being in touch with you soon, and thank you for the work that you are doing.